The flickering porch light, the slightly ajar front door, and a silence that felt wrong. This wasn't just an ordinary welfare check, it was the start of something far more unsettling. Police were called to a suburban home on Elmwood Drive after neighbors reported unusual activity, or rather a lack of it. A teenager, seemingly quiet and unassuming, had reportedly not been seen for days. What the responding officers found inside would rewrite everything they thought they knew about appearances. We're opening the case file on a truth that was hidden in plain sight, a series of overlooked details that led to an unthinkable discovery. Here's what the initial timeline shows, according to the official police report. On July 14th at approximately 7:15 p.m., a 911 call came in from Mrs. Eleanor Vance, who lives directly across the street. Her concern was unusual for the neighborhood, a place where everyone mostly kept to themselves. Mrs. Vance stated that she hadn't seen the resident, 17-year-old Ethan Miller, since the morning of July 10th. She mentioned mail piling up, and an uncharacteristic lack of activity from the usually lively, albeit reserved, teen. That detail matters, because it was the first small crack. 2 officers arrived at 7:35 p.m. They noted no signs of forced entry. The front door was unlocked, ajar, as some reports later detailed. A detail that initially seemed unremarkable, but would later become crucial. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Every light was off. The air was stale, still. It suggested nobody had been home for a considerable amount of time. Every step the officers took echoed in the empty space. They cleared the living room, the kitchen, before moving upstairs. What they were about to find, however, they were not prepared for. The official narrative would struggle with this next part, the discovery itself. A discrepancy emerges. The first officer on scene, Patrolman David Miller, arrived at 11:17 p.m. His report, filed the following morning, meticulously details the initial conditions. The front door ajar, no signs of forced entry, a single light switch near the entryway flipped to the off position. Yet, here's where it gets strange. The 911 call, logged at 11:03 p.m., explicitly stated a domestic disturbance was in progress, with shouting and sounds of breaking glass. That's a 14-minute gap between a reported violent incident and police arrival. And the scene itself, remarkably orderly for a disturbance of that nature. No broken glass was found. No significant disarray. This discrepancy immediately raises an important question. What transpired in those 14 minutes? And why did the initial assessment by Officer Miller overlook the obvious contradiction between the 911 dispatcher's notes and the physical evidence at the scene? The timeline doesn't add up, and that detail matters. The victim's last days. The discrepancy we encountered earlier, that odd 15-minute gap in the earliest police report, it leads us directly into understanding the victim's final hours. Let's look at the evidence from her last known day. The initial timeline constructed by detectives, based on her phone records and CCTV from her workplace, indicated she left her office building at precisely 5:07 p.m. However, security footage from a nearby cafe, a detail often overlooked in larger investigations, shows her entering at 5:12 p.m. She ordered a coffee, paid with her card, and left at 5:21 p.m. This places her just 2 blocks away from her apartment, a walk that would typically take no more than 5 to 7 minutes. Yet, her entry into her building isn't logged until 5:45 p.m. That's a 24-minute window. What happened in that small window after her coffee, but before she entered her apartment building? The official report simply states she returned home. What doesn't add up is the trajectory. Her apartment building entrance is directly across the street from the cafe. She should have been home by 5:28 at the latest. The police interviewed a doorman, a Mr. Harrison, who claimed he saw her enter, but couldn't recall the exact time, only that it was around 5:45. That's 5:45 p.m., a seemingly anodyne detail, but the record shows. What was she doing for nearly half an hour, within 200 feet of her home? No security cameras captured her outside. No witnesses came forward. It's a void in the timeline, an empty space where, according to the official file, nothing happened. But something must have. That detail matters, because it pushes the critical window much closer to the timeline of her disappearance. It's not just a minor inaccuracy. It's a missing piece that leaves questions lingering, unanswered by any of the initial statements. Interrogating the Alibis. The alibis. Always the first line of defense, but also often the first to crack under scrutiny. For the investigators assigned to this case, validating the movements of those closest to the victim was paramount. The official records confirm that Detective Miller and his team initiated alibi checks within hours of the discovery, a standard procedure, yet one that quickly yielded its first anomaly. Let's look at the evidence. The victim's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Davies, provided a clear, almost too perfect timeline. Dinner at home, a quiet evening watching television, retiring to bed around 11 p.m. Their statements were consistent, corroborated by cell phone data showing no calls out, no unusual activity. Their grief, according to early reports, seemed genuine, but grief, as we've learned many times before, can also be a powerful shield. Then there was Sarah, the victim's best friend. She claimed she was at a local diner, meeting with her new boyfriend, Mark, until just before midnight. This was confirmed by Mark's testimony and, critically, a credit card receipt for 2 milkshakes and a basket of fries, time-stamped 11:43 p.m. It placed her miles away from the scene at the time of the estimated incident. It looked solid, but here's where it gets strange. During a follow-up interview, Detective Miller noticed a subtle hesitation when he asked Sarah about the exact route she took home from the diner. She described taking the main road, a well-lit route, as most would. Yet, a week later, a patrol officer's log from that very night surfaced. It detailed a minor traffic stop, a broken taillight, on a much less frequented back road, usually a shortcut. The driver? A car matching Sarah's make and model. The time? Approximately 12:10 a.m. That's not a small inconsistency. Why would she omit that detail, and why take a long, dark shortcut when the main road was supposedly her chosen path home? The official version leaves this unexplained. A hidden digital footprint. The alibis, as we've established, were crumbling, each one revealing more questions than answers. Yet for investigators, something critical was still missing: the physical presence of the accused at the scene of the crime. That's where the digital footprint, or lack thereof, becomes paramount. According to official reports, initial searches of Mark's phone and computer yielded little. A typical teenager's browsing history, social media, gaming forums, some school-related research. Nothing immediately tied him to the brutal acts. But here's where the timeline shows a peculiar gap. Mark was known to be glued to his devices. His parents confirmed it, friends confirmed it. His digital life was extensive. Yet, for the critical hours surrounding the events, there was an unprecedented silence. No texts, no social media posts, no game logins. This raises an important question for a teenager obsessed with his phone: why the sudden digital blackout? This wasn't just an absence of incriminating evidence, it was an absence of any activity. The lack of standard digital noise for someone so digitally integrated was in itself a piece of evidence. It suggested a deliberate disengagement, a conscious decision to go offline. But why? And what did Mark truly do during those silent hours? The official narrative initially overlooked this. It wasn't until a deeper dive, sponsored by private investigators, those who chose to look beyond the surface, that a subtle yet significant detail emerged: a discarded prepaid burner phone. It was found months later, hidden under a floorboard in Mark's old treehouse, a place he hadn't visited in years. The phone itself was wiped clean, but its existence, its very acquisition in the weeks leading up to the crime. That detail matters immensely, and it suggests an entirely new level of premeditation. The Witness Recants. The digital footprint we uncovered, the deleted messages, the cached browser history, painted one picture. But then came the unexpected turn. A month after providing her initial statement, Jessica Chambers changed her story entirely, completely and unequivocally. Her initial testimony, the one that placed our subject, Kevin, at the abandoned boathouse that critical night, was now being recanted. She claimed she was pressured, confused, that she misremembered. We have to consider why someone would do this. Why would a witness, whose statements were deemed credible enough to stand, suddenly retract such crucial details? The records show her initial interview lasted nearly 3 hours. She was calm, coherent, and consistent in recounting her movements and what she saw that night. Legal documents confirm she identified Kevin from a photo lineup without hesitation. But the recantation, delivered through her attorney, stated she was under duress and frightened. This raises an important question. Who would frighten her enough to risk perjury? Police reports from the period immediately following her initial statement show no threats were reported. No unusual activity around her home. What changed? Notice this discrepancy. Her initial account detailed conversations she had with Kevin, specifics about his clothing, even a unique tattoo on his arm, details that would be difficult to fabricate and even harder to recall incorrectly. Yet, in her newer statement, these precise observations were dismissed as guesses or suggestions from investigators. The official version, eager to close the gap created by this retraction, dismissed her new statement as an attempt to avoid involvement. But that explanation feels too convenient. The evidence suggests something more complex. What doesn't add up is the sheer detail she provided initially compared to the vague, almost rehearsed nature of her recanted testimony. That detail matters, because it points not to a simple mistake, but to a deliberate shift. The timeline shows a period of 2 weeks before her recantation, during which she broke off contact with her closest friends and family, a detail confirmed by several witness accounts recorded in police interviews. She became isolated. That's where it gets strange. The pressure didn't come from the police, but from an unseen hand. The very digital shadows we probed earlier might offer a clue, a trace of influence, a silent threat that forced her to choose between truth and safety. And that choice leaves us with a gaping hole in the prosecution's case. Unraveling the Deception. The witness, a man identified only as Mr. Davies in the initial reports, recanted his statement under cross-examination. That detail matters. He initially claimed to have seen a figure matching the general description of the missing teenager, Alex, fleeing the scene around 11:30 p.m. This was a cornerstone of the prosecution's early timeline. But then, on the stand, he stated, and I quote, "It was dark. I was tired. I can't be certain. It could have been anyone." This unraveling began the deception. Now, here's what the timeline shows in its revised form. The initial 911 call came in at 11:17 p.m. The recanted testimony placed Alex 13 minutes later, a critical window. What doesn't add up is why a person so crucial to the initial narrative would suddenly have such a lapse in memory or clarity. The official version simply absorbed this recantation, shifting focus to other circumstantial evidence. But the evidence log asks, what prompted Mr. Davies' sudden uncertainty? Was it genuine, or was it applied? Investigators briefly considered witness intimidation. However, records show only a routine follow-up interview a week before the trial, nothing overtly threatening. But this detail matters. Mr. Davies' financial records, quietly reviewed during our investigation, show a significant undisclosed cash deposit made into his account 3 days after that follow-up interview. A deposit large enough to be noteworthy, yet small enough to avoid immediate electronic flagging. The paper trail tells a different story than the courtroom drama. His original statement, meticulous in its detail, described unique features, a dark hoodie, a distinctive gait, even the specific model of a bicycle seen propped near the site. All descriptions that strongly aligned with Alex. His recantation, however, reduced these specifics to vague generalities. This raises an important question. If the recantation was genuine, why was the initial statement so remarkably precise? And if it wasn't genuine, who benefits from muddying these waters? The police report, updated post-recantation, dismisses the discrepancy as common witness frailty under pressure. Yet, the timing of that financial transaction coupled with the sudden, drastic change in narrative begs for a deeper look. It suggests a deliberate effort to obscure rather than clarify. The timeline breaks here, not just because a witness changed his mind, but because something else, something hidden, seems to have orchestrated that change. Unraveling this deception, piece by piece, points towards a manipulation that the original investigators may have overlooked. The true culprit. The final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing not a planned, calculated act, but a desperate, impulsive decision. Remember the missing 20 minutes between Sarah's reported departure and the 911 call? That's where it gets strange. According to the recovered call logs, a frantic anonymous call was made from a payphone just 2 blocks from Sarah's home, not from her cell. The caller, breathless and clearly distressed, simply stated, "She's gone. It was an accident." Then the line went dead. This detail matters. Police initially dismissed it as a prank or a misdirection, given the lack of follow-up. But when investigators managed to enhance the audio quality, a faint, almost imperceptible detail emerged: the sound of a specific high-pitched cicada chirp, a species rare in that part of town, except for a particular cluster of trees in the old park. The park where Michael, Sarah's boyfriend, often met his friends. What doesn't add up is Michael's insistence that he was home, asleep, for the entire duration. His mother corroborated this. Yet, when questioned about his habits, she confirmed he frequently walked through that very park late at night. The paper trail tells a different story. Forensic analysis of the payphone showed fingerprints, smudged, but distinctive enough to point to a young male. Let's look at the evidence. When cross-referenced with prints taken from Michael's bedroom door, a match was made for his right index finger. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a deliberate act to obscure his location. The official version leaves this unexplained. It suggests he was there, making that desperate call. Not from home. We need to go back and check the record. What prompted that call? What accident? And why the anonymous tip? The truth, as it often does, remained hidden in plain sight. A teenager's panicked reaction, not the cold calculation of a hardened criminal. The silence that followed was not of calm, but of a terror-stricken individual trying to erase his own tracks. Now we know why the timeline didn't add up. The unanswered question. The verdict was clear. The jury convinced by what they saw as irrefutable evidence. Yet even with justice seemingly served, a shadow lingered, a question that persisted long after the courtroom lights dimmed. It wasn't about guilt or innocence anymore, it was about understanding the why. What truly drove a teenager, someone with no prior record, to commit such extreme violence? The official narrative, according to police reports, pointed to a clear motive: robbery and opportunity. But those documents, as we've consistently seen, often tell an incomplete story. They close the case, but they don't always close the book on the truth. Now, let's step back, beyond the court, beyond the timelines we meticulously reconstructed. This isn't about legal culpability, we've established that. This is about motive, the engine behind human action. The initial police theory stated a break-in for valuables, an opportunistic crime that escalated. However, as the detailed forensic reports revealed, certain items of value were left untouched. Cash on a bedside table, for instance. This contradicts the narrative of a simple robbery, doesn't it? It suggests a deeper, perhaps more personal motivation. Then there's the psychological profile compiled by Dr. Eleanor Vance based on recorded interviews and behavioral patterns. It described a deeply troubled individual, yes, but also one capable of calculated, almost cold detachment. Dr. Vance's assessment, which the prosecution largely downplayed, highlighted a pattern of escalating aggression stemming from unaddressed trauma. She pointed to specific instances of erratic behavior in school, dismissed by authorities as teenage angst. These weren't isolated incidents, they were a growing storm. The real unanswered question, the one that still haunts this investigation, goes to the very core of our societal understanding. How much responsibility do we bear when the warning signs are there, subtle perhaps, but present, and we choose to ignore them? The school reported bullying. Neighbors noted changes in behavior. Family members, though reluctant to speak publicly, later admitted to a growing sense of fear. These were threads, loose ends forming a tapestry of unspoken concern. But in the rush to judgment, they were overlooked, dismissed, or perhaps simply not seen as connected. This case, like so many others we examine here on the evidence log, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. It's easy to assign blame after the fact, to point fingers at the perpetrator and close the file. But what if the perpetrator himself was a product of silence and negligence? What if the true crime wasn't just the act itself, but the collective failure to see, to intervene, to understand the trajectory of a young life spiraling out of control? The evidence suggests a more complex reality. A reality where the monstrous act was not a sudden explosion, but the tragic culmination of years of quiet desperation. A reality that asks us to look beyond the headlines, beyond the single shocking moment, and into the intricate, often painful, tapestry of human experience. This is not a comfortable conclusion, but truth rarely is. Case closed, for now. If this investigation sparked your curiosity, if you appreciate meticulous analysis and evidence-first storytelling, consider liking this video and subscribing to the evidence log. And join us next time as we unravel another complex case, dissecting the facts until the truth emerges from the shadows.